Welcome to episode 34 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about in this episode at www.7, so SEVEN, health.com/34.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. Today is another show where I interview a guest, and this week I'm joined by Scott Kustes. And Scott is a former CrossFitter and Paleo evangelist who really, after many years, realized that the diet he's following wasn't helping his health. He is the author of a series of books called Kill Your Diet and co-hosts his own podcast show called Evil Sugar Radio. Gone are the days where he's focusing on extreme diets and restrictive regimes, and now he prefers to focus much more on easy health advice and global health and food politics and myths in the food industry. And I first became aware of Scott probably about a year ago through the podcast Evil Sugar Radio. I then bought his books, and in all honesty, they just sat on my Kindle unread. And then I was having an email conversation with someone, I think it was towards the end of last year, and they mentioned that they really liked Scott's books, and they thought that Scott and I had a similar approach in some of our advice around health. And so earlier this year, I then checked them out, and fairly recently after reading them, I just sent him an email straight away and said, look, I'd love to have you come on the show. So, look, I highly recommend checking out his books. He's just released another book as part of the Kill Your Diet series. So he's up to 3 books now. So I'll link to all of those in the show notes. But they're really good read, very interesting. So check them out, and I hope you enjoy the show. Scott, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been in the health and food scene for quite a while, but if we were to go back to the beginning, were you always interested in food?
I would say probably around 2002 or so, I started getting into martial arts.
Okay. And
through a martial arts forum, you remember back in the day when like the V Bulletin forums were big, through one of those I found CrossFit, which led me down a whole rabbit hole. You know, I got into CrossFit and got very evangelical about CrossFit is the only way, right? And then through that, I got led into all kinds of diet ideas, low carb of various stripes, and eventually I got to paleo. And from there, you know, I got and to be fair, that really kickstarted a lot of my interest in health in general, but it also led down paths towards, you know, anti-vaccination and anti-medicine and all kinds of various pathways that you really see get mixed up into the health industry outside of just very basic health information and helping people, you know, make positive changes in their life.
Yeah. And so at what age was this that you have then discovered those, got into the martial arts and then went down that road?
Well, I mean, I was always into sports. I played sports all my life, but when I graduated college in 2002 was around when that started. So around age 22, 23, you know, and then started getting really deep into paleo and alternative medicine and things of that stripe in my mid-20s, you know, when you know everything.
Yeah.
You know, I had discovered the Holy Grail, and I was going to tell everybody about it. You know how that goes. When you're young, you know it all, and then as you get older, you realize you don't know anything.
Yeah. I remember when I was starting out with nutrition, you read like a couple of books and you want to tell everyone about those couple of books, and that's the whole of the nutrition field is contained in those couple of books that you read. And then the more you learn,
you cram it into every dinner party.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, God, we have to invite him again.
But yeah, you then learn more, and you learn more and realize how little you know as time goes on.
Right. You realize that I think it was Greg Nuckols, wrote an article recently about how complex the body is, and actually how wonderful that is, because it makes the actual health part so simple, because the body really handles most of the stuff if you follow some very basic advice.
Yeah. And so before you got into this, I mean, if you were to go back into your childhood, was food a big part of your growing up? Did you have an interest in food then?
No, not really. I mean, I've always liked food. It's kind of funny when I'm traveling. People are like, "Well, do you like the food here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, the food's great. I like food." I've never had an aversion to any particular foods other than, when I was paleo, of course, I didn't eat non-paleo foods. That doesn't mean I didn't like them.
Yeah.
I just avoided them. But no, my mom likes to tell people the story of when I was a baby. A lot of babies try to fight the spoon as you try to feed them. She said when it came time to eat, I would fold my hands and just open my mouth. So, but both my mom and my stepdad cooked. So, I learned at a young age that there's, it's not like cooking's not the woman's job. So I never had any aversion to that. When I moved out on my own, I took to cooking. I love cooking. But it was never a big focus. I was out playing, running around the neighborhood, come home, eat. My parents typically cooked dinner. We didn't, do a lot in the way of like frozen meals or things like that. So I just kind of learned from a young age to, cook dinner, make your food at home and get on with life and don't put too much focus on it.
Yeah, which I think is some very good advice that people unfortunately learn after they've put themselves through the ringer for a number of years, if not decades, trying to do the perfect diet in inverted commas. Right.
It was, I learned those things from my parents, and then I discarded them when I learned the real truth. And, it's only been, say, the last 5 years that I've come back to that moderate middle ground of, if you're, if you're just cooking your food at home, obviously you can cook very unhealthy food at home, but if you're, cooking fruits and vegetables and meat and rice and potatoes, you're going to be fine.
Yeah. And so tell me then about the getting into the paleo side of things. I know you've written a number of books in a series called Kill Your Diet, which I'm going to chat about with you. But there's a section in one of the books where you're talking about the fact that you got into doing some blogging when blogging was a pretty niche thing to do. It was only starting to get big. It wasn't the way that it is now where it's such a saturated market. But why don't you explain a little bit about that and how you then got into that paleo movement?
Okay, yeah. Well, I've always been kind of a computer geek. Actually, my degree is in computer science. And so, early adopter of everything on the internet, from AOL 3.0 to online dating to blogging. So I started a blog when I was kind of into, just general low carb, and then it quickly converted into paleo blog, and it was one of the first paleo blogs. I don't know what number, but it was probably one of the first 5 real paleo blogs, and it was definitely before all of who you see as the really popular paleo people today. But it wasn't like today people start a blog because they want to make money, right?
Yeah.
It's a business. But that was really before there was an internet business model around that. We would hawk a few books here and there and make a couple $100, but it wasn't this big internet market. We were just out there just sharing our quote unquote research, our PubMed jockey research, right?
Yeah.
Look, here's everything you need to know that proves that I'm right. And I don't know, I probably did that for a good 5 or 6 years. And eventually I merged my blog with a friend of mine. And the problem we ran into was as we kind of came back from that very fundamentalist, kind of very hard, you have to avoid this, you have to be very restrictive and avoid these foods. We realized every article we wrote, we ended with, so don't worry too much about it, eat fresh food. And it kind of got to the point where there was nothing left to say, because we came to a point where we realized actually you don't need all these restrictions and complications. You just need pretty basic advice. And if what really works is to get people to follow the basic advice, not to overcomplicate things and make them worry about every bite of food they eat or whether their workout's the perfect workout, And then I moved to San Diego and I started drinking a lot of beer and eating tacos and pizza. Not drinking a lot of beer like an alcoholic, but my friends and I would go out and, they have a good craft beer scene, and we'd eat Taco Tuesdays and pizza and burgers. And I just I don't know that I ever made a conscious decision to quit. I just kind of quit.
Right. And had your health started to suffer from following that really restrictive way of eating, or even just your mental health, or it was never that bad for you, but actually you just saw that there was more to life than this kind of restrictedness?
Well, I mean, obviously it's hard to say with just looking at myself, but, I had, from all the years of low carb, if I ate much in the way of carbs, I had, reactive hypoglycemia, where, the carb coma.
Yeah.
Now that I eat a lot of carbs, I don't have that problem. Funny how that works.
Sure.
I had a little bout with shingles, which coincided with a lot of stuff. I was training really hard, running Masters Track, and I was going through a divorce, so a lot of stress. And I was probably under eating. I was low carb eating, paleo. When you combine a lot of these things, it becomes very hard to get enough calories.
Yeah.
So sure, I can't prove definitively, but I would say that yes, all of that wrapped up together probably contributed to some of that stuff. I just beat the hell out of myself with workouts. Between CrossFit, I destroyed my shoulder. I've had 2 shoulder surgeries. And then when I started running track, I still didn't take a reasonable approach to it. I went all out and just I had shin splints like you wouldn't believe. Just destroyed my legs for a year. And then the next year I was like, maybe I should take a smarter approach to training and not try to kill myself. And, as I started and stuff, you gain 5 or 10 pounds, but I don't have energy issues. I'm not always tired. I don't have sleep quality issues anymore.
Yeah, and it seems like a fair trade-off, which is one of the big things I always say when I'm working with clients, because I'm very much not about helping people lose weight in terms of this is going to be quick weight loss or anything along those lines. And a lot of the time when people have been following these various diets, they have been restricting. They haven't been getting in enough calories. And they then start to put on a little bit of weight going through the process. They're like, oh, I'm putting on weight. And I'm like, yeah, but you've got your period back and you're now sleeping through the night and you're not having energy crashes in the afternoon. So for me, it seems like a fair trade-off, but obviously you're the person who needs to make that decision.
Right. Well, and now excuse me. Now I look at myself and I'm like, I'm in good shape. I'm strong. I can go run or do pull-ups or whatever. I don't have energy crashes. If I wanted to, I could probably drop 10 pounds, no problem. But I kind of like the point I'm at where I'm still lean and healthy, but I can also eat whatever I want. I can go out to dinner with my girlfriend and not worry about, I gotta, this is gonna be a lot of carbs. I'm gonna have to offset that tomorrow, or we're gonna eat dessert and that's a lot of sugar. I eat. And most of the time I fall in the right calorie amount, right? Without focusing on it. But I think you hit a good point, which is when people fall out of the restrictive diets, they do gain weight. I probably gained 30 pounds and then dropped about 20 of it. Yeah. It's kind of it's like a pendulum. You go from really restrictive to I have to eat all of the ice cream right this second. Yeah. I went through that, so I understand when people do that. And then you kind of come to a point where you're like, maybe I don't want to keep going down this road. And there's a more reasonable level of eating the ice cream and the chips and the tacos and the pizza that doesn't include eating them all day, every day.
Totally. And I think that comes from the point where initially you're restricting, so they then become very novel. And then the novelty wears off after you've had them. And you can tell yourself you can have them all the time. And you get to that point where you're like, okay, I don't want them all the time because I've been eating a lot of them.
Yeah, and you can eat less of them, right? I can eat, a handful of chips instead of eating a bag of chips.
Totally.
Or eat, put some ice cream in a coffee mug instead of eating a half pint of Ben & Jerry's. Yeah.
And so, I mentioned before about the book series that you have writing and called Kill Your Diet. So the first book is called Processed in America. Do you want to give maybe a little bit of a synopsis about what it's about, or the Cliff's Notes? So for people who haven't read it, they can have a bit of an understanding.
Yeah. So the first book, well, the third one's going to be out soon, and I've kind of thought that as I've gone in and researching each of these various areas, I'm like, maybe this whole thing shouldn't have been wrapped up together, but whatever it is now, it's a series of books. And the first one talks a lot about the history of diet culture in America, and showing that the ideas today might be wrapped in new sciencey sounding terms, but the mentality around dieting hasn't changed. Now we have PubMed where any guy with a computer, now we have PubMed where any person with a computer can go and, find studies that support their viewpoint, and they can wrap, all these scientific sounding words around what they say, but the overall mentality of dieting has been the same for 150 years. It's restriction, it's, good foods and bad foods, and also, I talked about the processed food industry, and a lot of people like to blame the low-fat, the food pyramid for all of our ills, but what I really point out is that people never really followed it. Yeah. From the start, they went to, okay, well, instead of eating this processed food, I'll eat the low-fat version of this processed food. But they never, I'm pretty sure if people sat down and made, rice and potatoes and bread and fruits and vegetables and meats and followed the food pyramid, they'd be fine. Maybe plus a little fat or less a little fat depending on the person. But people didn't do that. What they did was they did what they were already doing from like the 1950s on, which was a heavily processed food, convenience food diet. And they made it a low-fat, heavily processed convenience food diet. And so it talks a lot about the history of food culture, diet culture in the United States. We don't have as good of a food culture because I think, as a very young country, we have a lot less of that traditional foods thing. So the processed food industry, and I mean, I love processed foods as much as anybody. I'm not against them, but you can't make them the cornerstone of your diet either. They're high in calories and low in vitamins and minerals, right?
Yeah. And very highly palatable, very easy to overconsume on them if they're making up a huge percentage of what you eat.
Right, lots of different textures, and I mean they can be really incredibly tasty, like you said, just highly palatable, delicious food. But I used to be this stuff's toxic and it has all of these cancer-causing things in it, and now I'm like, no, just don't eat them all the time. But the ingredients are fine, as long as you don't eat them all the time.
Yeah. And look, one of the things I really enjoyed about that first book, Processed in America, is it made me think a lot of like Michael Pollan's work, looking at like the omnivore's dilemma and the way that he looked at the history of food and the food landscape and how that's changed over that last like 150 years. And it was really interesting. I didn't know the history of America and how the change in suburbia and all of those things had such an impact on the food culture. So that was super interesting from my perspective. I mean, was there stuff that really surprised you when you started doing the research for that book?
Absolutely. I would say that through all of these books, I'm learning as I write them, and I'm learning a lot about the myths and misconceptions that are really rampant in the health industry that I fell for, and thinking, why do we fall for these things? I fell for them. So, and that's one of the things I try not to do. I'm kind of a sarcastic person, but what I try not to do is come across as, you're stupid for believing this, because I believed it too, right? So what I tell people is, you're not stupid. You have been misled in a lot of these respects, but, that doesn't mean you're stupid. One of the things that, the health industry is often very anti-conventional agriculture. And one of the things I tried to point out in the book is, yes, the agricultural system does have its problems, but there are also people within the agricultural system working to resolve those problems. And in the last 2 or 3 decades, great progress has been made on, environmental protection. And so I came to, and in the third book, I talk a lot about the medical system. And what the conclusion I've really come to is that every step we take forward, we encounter new problems, and then smart people go to work on them. They fix those problems, we step forward again, and we encounter new problems. But it's never going to be perfect. There's no utopia, right?
Yeah. And I think you talked in terms of the farming, that we can be very much like armchair farmers and talking about all these things like we know what it is to farm or raise cattle or grow things, when realistically majority of people who are talking about this stuff have no real world experience in doing any of it.
Right, and especially if running it as a business, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's easy to talk about what farmers should be doing when you aren't the one that has to pay the bills and put their kids through school and all of those various things. And I don't think a lot of people want to go back to farming, right? You know, you look back at 150 years, we were a very agricultural society. 70 or 80% of people worked on a farm in some manner. Now like 2%. And I doubt that most people want to go back to the very hard labor of farming.
Yeah. People want to go to the nostalgia of it. I mean, like I moved out to the country myself three years ago, moving from London to being in the countryside, and it's great, and I love being out here. But there's a big difference between that and then I'm making my living running a farm. Right, and you know, I used to, when I lived in Louisville, I would go to the farmers market, and you know, I had some farmer friends there, and one guy raised grass-fed beef and pork. And he got out of the business because he was like, it's very hard to make a living doing it. And it takes so much of my time. I want to spend my time with my grandkids, you know? So he just got out of it because it's a very hard business. And you know, that's why these farms get scaled up and, you know, they become huge because that's how you make a living doing it. And actually one of the things that surprised me, and it made perfect sense once I read it, I just never thought about it. We actually eat a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables today than really ever in human history, because it's only in the last 60 years with at least in the United States, I can't speak to Europe or any other place, but in the last 60 years with the creation of the interstate highway system and the refrigerated truck, that you could transport lots of fresh produce from the country to the city. So, you know, it's very easy to talk about the past as being wonderful, but really the past is kind of a myth. A lot of houses in the U.S., the majority didn't even have refrigeration until the 40s and 50s. So, you know, people had ice boxes. And, you know, people talk about the past as being so wonderful and how healthy everybody was, but it's really just not true. You know, we've made great advances and we will continue to make great advances, but the doom and gloom, very self-serving doom and gloom that helps sell books and detox kits and coaching plans and all of this stuff of the health industry, is a lot of it's a myth. And just in terms of your comments there about eating more fruits and vegetables, like I walk around a supermarket now and you look, especially in the UK, and I'll look and it's like, this one has come over from this part of Europe, this has come from this part of Europe. Like no matter what time of year, you can get mangoes, you can get bananas, you can get like every fruit and vegetable is available all the time. And you're right, like that couldn't have been possible so long ago, and people would have been eating the same things over and over and over again. Yeah, and canned, a lot of canned, like there wasn't even frozen food because people didn't have freezers. So a lot of canned goods, right? And who wants to eat, I mean, if I've got a choice of fresh green beans or canned green beans, I'm going fresh. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a real eye-opener because, you know, I believed a lot of these things, that the food system's horribly, you know, just completely messed up. No, there are very good things. Like you said, mangoes. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. We don't grow mangoes in Louisville. We can't grow mangoes and pineapple and things. And, you know, I love tropical fruits. So yeah, there are very, very good things about the food system. And there for sure. But I think a lot of our health gurus have a tendency to look at the cons and play up only the cons without looking at the pros. And one of the pros is we have a lot of calories very cheaply, which the flip side is we also have more overweight and obesity, but on the other hand, we don't have too many problems with people starving. Yeah. Obesity might knock 5-10 years off your life, but starvation will make your life really uncomfortable right now. Yeah, and the thing with starvation now, it's not about the food not being available, it's about the fact that there's issues getting that food to someone, or people are discarding food to do things for economic reasons, etc. Like I think there's a real big myth around the fact that we need more food because there's a genuine food shortage, and that's not the case. Right, and now it's political and, you know, like you said, business, economic decisions versus
the flip side, the old problem was there often wasn't enough food, or a famine could wipe out the single crop that, a group in a certain area depended on. Now we have a highly varied diet, so we don't have to worry about that. The flip side of that is now we have sedentary jobs and a lot of food. So it's very easy to eat 600-700 extra calories a day and not burn them off.
And this is, one of the things that you wrote about in the book, which I'd never heard of before, was the problem of the fixed stomach. Do you want to just explain what that is?
Oh, yeah. It's so food companies. Give me a second to think. Okay, so as income rises, people doubled. You're not going to eat twice as much food, right? You're going to eat roughly the same amount of food. You might change the food you eat. You might start, buying all grass-fed beef from your local farmer and pay twice as much or whatever, but you're not going to eat twice as many calories. So food companies, through their marketing, are competing for a share of the amount of calories that each person's going to eat, plus or minus a few. Now, what we've done with our processed foods, as you've mentioned, is we've figured out how to cram a lot of calories into them. So, I don't know this for a fact, but I feel like we eat more by volume than by calorie content. Like if I drink a cup of water or a cup of ice cream, I'm not going to feel necessarily more full from one or the other, but the calorie difference is huge, right?
Yeah.
So that's the fixed stomach, plus or minus, you're going to eat roughly the same amount of calories roughly the same amount of food, no matter how much your income goes up. And you see this happening in various countries. Look at Mexico. As their income has risen, I don't know that they're eating so much more food, but they're eating so much more processed food versus their traditional diet that they now outpace the United States in obesity, which is phenomenal. I mean, how do you outpace the United States in obesity, right?
Yeah. I think in terms of the only thing I'd say with the fixed stomach idea is if people are eating more very fibrous vegetables, that's obviously going to take up a whole heap of space for very little calories or whatever. But yeah, what you said before then is definitely true.
Right, and that's the thing is, there's I feel like a lot of people like the us versus them mentality, like it's this one thing or it's this one thing. And so it's not calories, it's quantity, it's not quantity, it's quality.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's if it fits your macros, both matter, right? If you eat high quality, fibrous vegetables and fruits and things, you're naturally going to lower your calorie intake. And I think that's why a lot of these diets work. Look at, take paleo, for instance, and you could apply these same things to any of the diets. It's just paleo is the one I'm most intimately familiar with.
Yeah.
If you cut out bread and rice and potatoes, potatoes are back on the menu now because the paleo gurus decided that they're paleo. But, if you cut out bread, you don't just cut out the bread. You cut out the butter, the jelly, the peanut butter, the cheese, the meat. You cut out everything you put on a sandwich. If you cut out rice, I like my rice really buttery. I've done the calculation. My rice, those carbs, are roughly a third fat by the time I'm done adding butter and salt to them.
Yeah.
So these diet rules do make it easy to control your calories because they tend to cut out very caloric sources of food. You cut out all your dairy, you cut out ice cream, you cut out cheese, you cut out milk. Those are very caloric foods.
Yeah, but you then get to a point where you cut out so many different things that someone's in a situation where they're then craving different foods and they feel so restricted.
Exactly. Hang on one second, the phone's ringing. I don't want to answer it, but I don't want. Can you hear it?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Exactly. And, in that book, I talk about how diets in the old days, for the most part, used to be about, slimming down in the short term. They were the crash diet.
Yeah.
It's only really been in the last, say, 20 years or so that it's become the lifestyle diet where you're going to be following this restrictive diet for the rest of your life. And that's where the problems come in because obviously the yo-yo dieting is a problem, but people don't follow those very restrictive diets that they do for a month or two for the rest of their life where they're running into problems with except with long-term calorie restriction and also the mentality that gets wrapped around it, the constant worry about whether it's the perfect diet. Is my diet perfect enough?
Yeah.
I was eating dinner with my girlfriend's family, and we had meat that was sauteed with some spices and, onions and stuff, a salad, rice, potatoes, fried plantains, and juice. And now to, most of the 7.3 billion people in the world, that's a normal meal, right? Covers your nutritional bases, it's varied, has fruits and vegetables and starches and meat. But to the U.S. diet community, and probably to diet community as we continue to export that mentality, there's always something that can be removed. Oh, it's too many carbs, it's too much starch, the juice, you shouldn't drink juice because it's sugary. There's always something to worry about no matter what you're eating.
Yeah. And so one of the other things that you mentioned as part of the book was the way that most people don't really understand what goes into research and understanding research and looking at what it really shows. Do you want to talk about this for a little bit? Because this was something that I think is really important for people to really understand.
Yeah, that's in the second book,
yeah.
Thou Shalt Not Eat. And that was, again, an eye-opener for me, a learning experience to say, like, oh, here's what I was doing for all of those years.
Yeah.
Now I get it. So, like I've mentioned, people have access to PubMed or Google Scholar, and you can look up a study. And you can find a study that supports any viewpoint. No matter what your viewpoint is, you can find a study. And often the studies you find, one, aren't done in humans. And so what I pointed out was the hierarchy of studies. Like, I don't read studies. I don't think most people need to read studies. I leave that to the doctors and the researchers and the scientists. And then, you look at what comes out the other side. What do they recommend based on those studies? But what happens a lot of times is you'll see, for instance, a low-carb guru will find a study that says low carb is better than low fat. But if you look at the total preponderance of the evidence, the studies even out and say it doesn't really matter as long as calories are controlled. But someone with an agenda, and they may not even realize they're doing this, they go and they find the studies that support their viewpoint, and they don't look at the ones that don't.
Yeah.
And I remember I was into intermittent fasting for a while, and I wrote up a big, long article, and I had these citations, and Martin Birkin emailed me, and he said, hey, can you provide me a link to that study? And I went and I found it, and then I looked at it, and I was like, oh, actually, this was done in rats. Now, today I realized that a rat study really means nothing for humans. Like, that's a starting point.
Yeah.
And it happened recently. There was a Splenda study done in rats, and the headlines are like, why you should never use Splenda, the toxic substance. And, like, no, it was done in rats, and when you look at the study, it was like 75 or 100 times the safe limit that they fed the rats. And, so it's the media reporting of science and the alternative media as well, both mainstream and the blogger community. They report on science without really understanding what goes into turning science into actionable results.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of us who don't come from a scientific background are guilty of that, of finding something that supports what I believe in, and therefore, look, this proves that I'm right. Maybe not.
And look, I know, like, me personally, I don't understand research. Like, I don't know what the p-value here is or what this means there or whatever. So I have to use other people to be then doing that. And so you then find sources where you're like, I trust this person because I've seen what the research they've done before, or they do their own research in terms of like doing their own research in a lab or whatever, and finding those sources and then reading what they talk about as part of a piece of research, or what they talk about as part of that, because I'm not qualified to do that.
Right, and that's exactly where I find myself now. Is it's like I can look at when someone is making the mistake in reporting science, but that doesn't mean I can go read the study and say, and here is what this actually means. Like, it's kind of like watching, I can't play tennis, but I can tell you what bad tennis looks like.
Yeah, sure.
And part of what I want to point out to people is, like, think about what you know about your job, whether you're an accountant or a computer programmer, and how long it's taken you to come to that knowledge. And now realize that the people who are investigating viruses and, immunology and vaccines and GMOs and all of these various things, they know that much about their job. And think about how, like, you don't see doctors walking into an accounting office and like, here's the real truth about accounting that I've discovered, and here's how you should be doing your T accounts. Like, people would like, dude, get out of here. You're a pediatrician. Go do pediatrician stuff. But former restaurant managers and accountants and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs have no qualms about flipping that on its head and doing the same thing to doctors and researchers and scientists with their, decades of experience in education.
Yeah. And what I would say is when I read through that stuff, there's a real big difference in my book between someone who's a researcher and someone who's a practitioner. Because I then read a lot of the time what researchers then prescribe based on what's going on. And my reaction then is, I've tried that out and it doesn't work for these various reasons, because I then work with people one-on-one in the real world. Yeah. And so I think it's then important for people to make that distinction between, okay, what is someone's like primary role as part of their job? Because that research is great, and I look what people are saying about certain research or what certain findings have been, but then it's very different when I'm doing that in a real world environment where like human beings aren't nice and straightforward like the research would imply. Like, it gets much messier when you're taking into consideration all of these different variables in someone's life.
Exactly. And do you follow Dr. Spencer Nadolsky?
Yes.
I don't remember if we interviewed him on Evil Sugar Radio or if I just saw him write about it, that, like you just said, it's great to have these ideas about what people should do, but, he actually works with obese patients, and sometimes, compliance is the real issue. So
exactly.
He has patients where he's like, the best thing I can do for him is write him a prescription because they're not going to actually comply. And then people, these doctors just write prescriptions. Well, maybe the doctors have seen 5 other patients that day who didn't comply with the last thing they did. And so they're just exhausted, like, you know what, here's your prescription, get out of my office, because, not that it's right. Yeah. I'm not that it's right, but it's the human side of things. There was a random lady I was talking to, and she said, I had a doctor's appointment today, and the doctor wasn't happy because I haven't been taking my pills. They aren't too pleased when you don't do what they say. I'm like, of course. Like, it'd be like if I asked her for advice and then didn't follow it. She'd be like, well, why'd you ask me for my advice? Yeah. And I wonder how often we see just that side of things. Oh, well, this lady's unhealthy, and she's been going to the doctor. Obviously, the doctor's not helping her, but she's not actually following the advice she's given. Totally.
No. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But yeah, I do. I mean, when I read blogs, I can tell who is a practitioner and who is not, because you get a new level of flexibility in terms of the readings around different research and stuff when you are having that real world experience.
Well, and that was going back to Dr. Spencer again. He said, I'm not pro low carb or I'm not anti low carb. I'm pro my patient, and I'm going to find what works for them. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing for people to do, is to not approach things from an ideological perspective that this is the right way and this is what everyone should be doing. It's people are people, and we all have different needs and goals and desires and ways of living. Like, if I don't want to give up a bunch of food unless it's like you're going to die unless you change your diet. Well, even that's hard for a lot of people, right? Yeah. But just for these general fluffy goals, find what works.
Totally. And I would say, like, there are people who do well on low carb. There are people who do well on paleo. There are people who do well on vegetarian, whatever it may be. But you're right. It's got to be that genuinely works for you, as opposed to I read it in a book and that's why I'm following it. Right. And like something you said earlier on about people really getting into diets, I think diets has become a really big part of someone's identity, which it just never was until, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
People didn't get into it in the same way where it's like, I am paleo or I am whatever it may be. And that's a very new thing. People used to just eat food.
Yeah, and now it's like they have to announce it to the world. Oh, I can't eat that. It's got gluten. I'm gluten free now.
Yeah.
Like, you just, okay. Like, it's very annoying when you go to a party and everybody's got their own list of restrictions, and you're the crazy one when you're not on a diet.
Yeah.
Like, it's really weird for that to be where we are now, is that the person who just eats without worrying too much about it is the crazy person.
Yeah. And I saw something very interesting where there was someone who has celiac disease and had written a blog post like how annoyed she was that everyone was jumping on the no gluten bandwagon, because she was just like, now when I go to the restaurant and I say I can't have that, she's like, it's so much more likely that the kitchen just doesn't really listen that much, because they're like, yeah, we've had like a whole ton of these people in tonight, so it doesn't matter so much. And she's like, no, it is really important for me.
Yeah, I've seen some articles about that where, on the one hand, there are now many more gluten-free products available, but on the other, now they go to a restaurant. And you see, like, Food Babe told her followers to actually tell the restaurant that they have a serious gluten allergy.
Yeah.
Like, to fake a food allergy for their trendy, fad diet. And that doesn't help people with real gluten problems.
No. And so you said you're just finishing off the third book. So what's the third book in the series about?
Similar to the way I looked at agriculture in the first one, pros and cons. I don't know that I rewrote this book 3 times, and I think it kind of morphed each time.
Okay.
I get like halfway done, and I'm like, it's not really going the direction I want. It's really looking at marketing of medicine and alternative medicine, and the way that while there are problems in the medical system, for the most part, like the agricultural system, there are more pros than cons, and there are people working hard to improve the medical system, and then looking at the way that health gurus promote often a lot of alternative medicine ideas, like, alternative medicine treats the whole person, and I point out, like, not really. What you have is, look at any particular naturopath or whatever, they usually have 1 or 2 root cause diseases. You have adrenal fatigue, or you have this. My former naturopath, he starts everyone with hair testing, which is a completely inaccurate test, but from that he creates a supplement program for them, and I followed it for about a year, I guess. Spent thousands of dollars on supplements, 15 or 20 different supplements twice a day, for 3 months, and then you test again and you change your supplement program. And I'm like, if they're doing the same thing for everyone, that's not treating the whole person. So I'm sure someone's going to come back and say I'm a big pharma shill, but what I try to point out is you don't have to like big pharma to also realize that these people are marketing to you, and it's a very, very big industry, and they're making billions of dollars selling you a lot of dubious ideas. So, kind of, again, walking people through, and the conspiracy theories that are really big in the health industry. I don't know if they're as big over in the UK, but in the US, we are big conspiracy theorists.
Okay.
And they wrapped up into medical ideas. The big pharma owns the FDA, and big pharma doesn't want to find a cure for cancer. And I point out, like, these things are, I used to believe in a lot of the conspiracy theories too. But once you really dig into them, you realize how completely implausible they are. For instance, I still see it in several health groups I stay in just to read stuff that makes me laugh. Big pharma doesn't want to find a cure for cancer because cancer is a $80 billion industry. And I'm like, but big pharma is nearly 200 different companies, and the one company that develops a cure for one single type of cancer is going to make so much money. Like, think about if you had the cure for any disease, type 1 diabetes, breast cancer, and your company had a patent on that. You would be in a new yacht. Like, if you were the CEO, the CEO would love to find that cure, because he would be laughing at his CEO buddies in the other companies. Like, look at how much money we're making. So when you really look at it, these ideas kind of fail on the face of them. That doesn't mean everyone needs to run to the doctor every time they stub their toe for an antibiotic prescription. There are definite problems with, overuse of antibiotics and things of that nature. But a lot of the ideas, and you see, again, going back to people, researchers and scientists, you see guys who come from outside the field offering medical advice to people. Or you see people going into Facebook forums asking medical advice from other people who aren't doctors or researchers. I saw a guy go, I get drunk easy, or, if I smoke weed or take, Tylenol with codeine or something, like these drugs affect me a lot. And people are like, well, it could be a liver problem. And I'm like, that's awesome. Now the guy thinks he has a liver problem when really he just has a low tolerance.
Yeah.
Like if he went to a doctor and said, I get drunk easy, the doctor would say, okay, so you save some money on drinking beer. Great. But these guys are like, you probably have a liver problem and you need to, do this and this and this. Like, wow, talk about giving the guy a complex.
Yeah. And look, he could have something going on with the liver, but you'd probably want to see a list of other symptoms that were going alongside that would make you think maybe that's more plausible.
Right, like he could have a liver problem, but you might want to go get a diagnosis, have your liver checked, and then, follow a treatment program that's backed by some evidence that rather than going on a forum and somebody says, oh, you probably have a liver problem and these supplements support your liver, and so he goes and starts taking them.
Yeah.
And I point out that the supplement industry, at least in the U.S., is a completely unregulated industry. There's nothing saying that what the bottle says the supplement does is what it actually does. It might do nothing. It might just drain your wallet. Some of them can actually be dangerous. They're not tested for purity or anything. There's been recent studies and surveys done on these various supplements, and they found they're tainted with all kinds of things. Or they might contain, 1% of what they say on the bottle. So really a lot of the health industry, the supplement industry, the alternative medicine industry is kind of the wild, wild west out there. And you got to be really, really wary, especially when people are coming at you. Don't use vaccines. They're dangerous. They're a big pharma conspiracy. They're like, no. Like I said, I kind of ventured into anti-vaccine waters. Yeah. And I've come back from there. And now I'm like, whoa, that's like one of the greatest advances in human history that there is. The risk-benefit ratio for vaccines is off the charts. There is probably no medical treatment safer. And now we have these huge groups of people. It's really only through the success of things like vaccines that we can have that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, look, vaccines are something that is definitely not my area of specialty. So when someone asks me, it's like, do your own research. Because I genuinely haven't looked into it enough. But look, what you're saying is my general sense is people should be vaccinating. But that's about as far as I go, because it's not something that I can have a proper discussion on, because it's not something I've looked into in any great detail.
Right, and that's, I briefly touch on it in that book and point out, like, this is all this stuff that's being discussed is a layman's version of cracking like one ice cube's worth of immunology and medical research off of the entire iceberg that is all of that. Like, I think helping people understand how complex it is and how even within, research, like an immunologist won't necessarily understand what a cardiologist understands. And we have people in the health industry, these health blogger gurus, who pretend that they understand all of it. Whereas the real scientists, they're so specialized that they, when they get a question about viruses, and they're calling up their virology buddies, and the virologist is calling up the bacteriologist for bacteria questions. They're not like, oh, well, through my Google research, I've come to this conclusion. They're like, you should probably call someone with a specialty in that area.
Yeah. And so you also run a podcast called Evil Sugar Radio. So how long have you been doing that for?
This summer will be 3 years. We've taken a bit of a break for the last 3 months, and we're working on, relaunching with, I wouldn't say a new direction, but, some new ideas and a new focus on it.
Okay. And so what was the idea about it when you started, and where are you wanting to take it?
Well, Antonio and I both come from, excuse me, Antonio and I both come from a background of restrictive diets and health ideas. And, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've both become much more skeptical of claims by the health industry. And so we just wanted to help people find simple, healthy advice without all of the worry and the stress and the, you know, very neurotic focus on, you know, cure-alls and restrictive diets and kind of the extreme aspect of the diet and health community. And, you know, we wanted to interview people, and like we try to expand the discussion beyond which food should you not eat. Like we just interviewed Raj Patel. We talked about the global food system, food politics, things of that sort that take the discussion a little bit beyond, you know, you need to avoid these foods and you have to do this one specific exercise program. Yeah. Like, let's talk about culture. Let's talk about food in the broader context of celebration and enjoying food and enjoying life, because, you know, I know it's a cliche, but, you know, we only get 80 or 90 years, so do you really want to spend it worrying about every bite of food you take?
Yeah. And I know before we started recording this, we were chatting about you doing lots of traveling and that being such a big part of your life. I mean, has that had a real impact on this change in direction by going around and experiencing those different foods and those different cultures?
Definitely. You know, like I said, I moved to San Diego and lived there for a little over a year, and, you know, a lot of celebrating and just not worrying too much. And then after that, I spent a year driving around the U.S. And so, you know, I camped in Alaska for a month and went and worked on farms in various states, New Mexico, Colorado, Georgia. And you go to these places and you see healthy people who aren't following all these restrictive ideas. They're just living life and loving life and, you know, enjoying it. And then after that, I've been to Bolivia and Colombia, and now I have a girlfriend in Ecuador, so I spend a lot of time down here. And you just don't see people freaking out about food at all of these places. You just see people eating, enjoying it. And, all of that has definitely kind of helped me see that. I like to look at the blue zones, you know, the areas where people live to 100. A lot of that, of course, is genetic. But you can look at their lifestyle and see, what do? They eat fresh food, and they kind of have a traditional diet of, you know, whatever, but those vary across the world. They go dancing, they sometimes smoke a cigar, drink some scotch, you know, make love, whatever, but they don't spend their life worrying about their diet.
And they don't spend their life worrying about exercise either. Like, most of them are very natural in terms of their movement, as part of their day-to-day life, but it's not like they're not doing running or lifting weights or going to a gym or anything along those lines.
Right, that's true. Their lifestyle is much more low-intensity activity. I mean, right before this call, I went to the park and worked out. I've got nothing against working out. I think lifting weights is probably one of the best things people can do for long-term health, but you don't see that laser focus on health in healthy people around the world. And you know, you've probably see it in London, or if you go to New York City, where people tend to walk and take public transportation more, they tend to be leaner and look a lot healthier than if you go to, say, the southern United States, where it's hot and it's humid, and, you know, you would much rather be inside during a Kentucky summer than anywhere outside. Like, it's very easy to understand why certain places it's hard to stay healthy, because you have, you know, heavy, processed, highly caloric, fried foods, things of that nature, and it's smothering for half the year. Like, Kentucky summer is 90 degrees with 100% humidity.
Yeah.
Who wants to go running in that? Like, I've gone running at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and as soon as you step outside, you're like, oh my God, I want to die. You just immediately start sweating.
Yeah. And so, look, we're about out of time, but Before we go, like, where can people find out more information about you? You mentioned about the upcoming book, and I'm going to put links to all of this stuff in the show notes. But yeah, where can people find out more information?
Pretty easy. My website is scottkustes.com. It's Kustes. And so there's not a lot on the site right now, but there's an email sign-up form, and I keep people informed about my books and other things. Like, I like to tell people what I've been reading. I've had a few people who said, I really appreciate that you tell us what you're reading, because I like to read books by other people. So, yeah, I keep people informed about, book recommendations and other things, but mainly I use it for just telling people, hey, here's my book, here's how you can get it. I usually give away quite a few free copies, and also evilsugarradio.com. You can subscribe through iTunes, and we are getting the podcast back on track, back to a weekly schedule.
Perfect. Well, look, is there any book that you're reading at the moment that people should be checking out apart from yours?
Well, the one I'm reading right now is The World Before Yesterday, The World Until Yesterday, something like that, by Jared Diamond.
Okay. He wrote that Guns, Germs, and Steel. Is that the same guy?
Yeah, he had that was a good series. The Third Chimpanzee, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Collapse, I think, were the 3 books. And then I think he has other books, but this is the 4th one by him I've read. Okay. And previously I read Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. Yep. For those in the health industry, those health seekers, that's a good one to read, to see how both, again, like I point out in the 3rd book, it's not big pharma versus alternative medicine. Both of them are engaging in shady marketing practices, and that's a really good book to see how and why we get led off track by very effective bad marketing.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks so much for coming on the show, Scott. I really enjoyed reading your books, and very much anticipating the next one. It's nice to chat with someone and to read information which is so level-headed and not with the hype and the pseudoscience. So, yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, health.com.